Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to Aurum Equity Partners webinar. Will medical devices be the next growth catalyst in Indian healthcare? This is Gautam Dhawan and one of the partners at Aurum Equity, focusing on the pharma and healthcare vertical. I have close to 18 years of investment banking experience handling several transactions across industries. I have also advised many Indian and MNC companies in their strategic initiatives involving fundraisings, mergers and acquisitions, and restructurings. Today, I have the great privilege of introducing Mr. Probir Das, who has 25 years of experience in the segment with multinational companies and is currently the managing director of Terumo India. He is also the co-chair of the prestigious NatHealth's Medical Device Forum. So let me ask Probir, that you have such great operating and strategic experience in the medical devices industry. Could you take a moment to kindly explain your experiences as you've led various MNC's growth initiatives in India?
Hi everybody, and thanks Gautam. The points that I share are predominantly drawn from my experience of more than 2 decades, you say 25, 26 years in this trade, and also from the fact that I work with several of my peer companies very, very closely in my role as the NatHealth MedTech Forum co-chair and as FICCI's Medical Technology Medical Devices Forum chairperson. Now, to answer your question, I think the whole approach to universal healthcare now in India, where healthcare has largely been marginalized to a very small section of the population, the focus, the increasing focus on universal healthcare is going to really have a very, very positive impact on medical technology sector, and not just medical technology sector, but overall healthcare delivery and any areas associated with it. We are talking about a conservative estimate of perhaps building 6,000 new hospitals by 2020. And I personally believe this is the only market in the whole world where this massive level of infrastructure built is happening in the current market conditions. Compare this with several other countries where they're actually rolling back healthcare infrastructure or making it more efficient. So there is apparent attractiveness for sure. And the last piece is the fact that, today our penetration is so low. I mean, per capita medical technology consumption in India is $3. That's one of the lowest in the world. I mean, if you compare that with, Brazil, it's $28 in Brazil, $43 in Russia. China equals UK at $178 per capita of medtech consumption. The developed market economies like US, Japan, Germany have 400 plus or 200 plus or $300 plus respectively, that level of per capita consumption of medical devices. So net, I think the drive is northwards for more number of reasons than one, and some of them I just mentioned.
Great. Now, just moving ahead, when we look at the global devices market, it's a large market, close to about $370 billion. And we've noticed, 3 or 4 interesting trends. First of all, growth at 4% is muted. We're seeing that that power is concentrated in the hands of 30 to 35 global medtech companies, and the fact that there is a shift or greater reliance for growth within emerging markets. Now, if you look at this, contrast, how do you feel that, emerging markets growth will shape up over the next few years vis-a-vis the developed markets?
Great question. Essentially, I suppose you talked about two things. Number one, you talked about the fact that power, as you mentioned, power is in the hands of 30-40 top players. It is indeed a fact that 60% of global medtech revenues come from top 40 players. And this is a very unique industry to that effect. Now, this also goes to prove that how technology-led this is, how knowledge-led this is, and how non-replicable easily this is, right? So, if in the whole world there are 40 companies which control 60% of medtech share, it means that they not just control, but they also have the knowledge or the domain expertise to create value in that area. Now, and that is where I think it is very important for emerging countries like India to make sure that we don't work in non-alignment with this 40-50 companies, and whatever we do from a policy architecture standpoint is designed in alignment to the interests of these 40 or 50 companies. That said, to comment on your question on what I see as the role of emerging markets, right now, if you talk to global leadership, not just in medtech, I think generally global leadership, there is a lot of uncertainty with regard to emerging markets. 5 or 6 years back, we were all talking about BRICS. It doesn't exist. Brazil has sort of shrunk. Russia is collapsing. India is good news still. China is slowing down, and South Africa has almost attained insignificant status. So, and then to complexify things even further, if you look at the current currency situations in most of the emerging markets, the situation is not good. It's pretty bleak. So the amount of value that you create in market creation often gets depleted, or more value gets depleted in currency washouts. So there is risk, but within that environment, you see fundamentally healthcare or medical devices, they will have to revolve around the theses of population growth, need to drive as close as possible to Millennium Development Goals, the need for better healthcare infrastructure, and all of that is still fundamentally all right in emerging markets. So if one is able, so far the challenges have been that large multinationals have tried to milk their developed market products, right? Products which were originally developed for developed markets, and milk the emerging markets. In my view, that paradigm will change. In my view, large multinationals are realizing that they need to do a whole range of product re-engineering for emerging markets, find allies in emerging markets who will help them through this product re-engineering process, and help them avail low-cost manufacturing bases, etc., in these emerging markets. And once this plays out, or as this plays out, you will see the emerging markets for sure playing a very, very large role in reshaping the footprint of medical devices in the world.
Great. Moving on to the Indian medical devices market, I think sure at $3.8 billion, I think it is hugely underpenetrated. Not only, if you look at the pharma market or even the healthcare delivery market, in comparison to that, it is highly underpenetrated. I think even from a global standpoint basis, probably, the penetration is probably even below 1%. Basically, I think, when you look at this, Probir, And if you sort of, dovetail this, and if you try and look for, key learnings and what could have been the root causes, I'm sure things like, low public spending is a key parameter over here. The lack of a conducive manufacturing environment and innovation are some of the key themes revolving around the root causes. So Probir, when you look at it, what in your mind are the primary reasons for this underpenetration, and what are the key learnings that one can take away from this?
Gautam, you started with the conversation on sort of comparison between pharma and medtech. Let me extend that a little bit to sort of put some perspective. Yes, at 3.8 or whatever, 3.8, 4.5, whatever the number is, medical devices in India, the market is very, very small. And we just talked about the low penetrations. But it is not that in pharma, India has a very high penetration, right? If you look at the total market of pharmaceutical is $15 billion in India, but roughly 50% of that is coming through exports. It is not consumption-led. If you look at consumption, we are still under-penetrated in India, and to a large extent, this under-penetration of both pharma and medical devices is because of the fact that both of us are actually ancillary industries to healthcare. Healthcare delivery is under-penetrated in India.
No doubt.
Right? Any amount of healthcare delivery, even the lowest tertiary care, the lowest level of tertiary care, is only addressing 300, 400 million people at the maximum. Right? In a country full of 1.2 plus billion people, that's very, very low levels of penetration. Right? Now, coming back to this point as to, then the question is, then if pharma is able to balance the low penetration in India with a very high export orientation, at least balance it out from a overall size of the market or the value piece, what is keeping medical devices behind? And to that, I would talk about the fact that pharma and medical devices, while they are often talked in the same breath, they are vastly different, right? In a pharma, even in specialty pharma, you're essentially talking about API, a certain dilution of that API, through several levels of purified water or several other things, and then you're talking whether it becomes a tablet or an injectable or a syrup. So it's not that complex. Wherein if you're talking about medical devices, well, right from a humble syringe, wherein you would, you are requiring a huge engineering machinery, injection molding, needle, the whole grinding of needles, metallurgy, all of that. So plastic engineering, metallurgy, and that's for a syringe, which is like the lowest tech medical device. Now, if you look at things like a pacemaker or an implantable device, then you are talking about metallurgy, plastic engineering, fluidics, electrical, electronics, oftentimes digital. You are talking about several layers of engineering solutions and technology, which makes it extremely, extremely complex, right? And then the levels of regulation, right, of an implantable device and that of a pharma clinical trial would obviously be very different. So you are talking about high complexity, very, very high entry barriers, tremendous deep pockets to make sure that technology is apt and is validated. So it's a very, very different infrastructural requirement and skill requirement. And in there, the medical devices industry is but about 15, 20 years old in India. Even 15 or 20 years old, there wasn't really a medical devices industry in India. So we are a very, very young industry compared to pharma, which is at least 50 years old in India. So you would need to look at this through this lens of complexity and the fact that this complexity can only be fostered through driving a much larger ecosystem. It's not going to be a single promoter driven that I put together a pharma manufacturing unit. I mean, it's, manufacturing petroleum is relatively easy than manufacturing an automobile, right? Pharma is the petroleum surrogate, wherein a medical device is an automobile surrogate. And to build an automobile, you need a far larger ecosystem than crude and refinery, right? So that's holding us back, if I may answer that question.
Yeah. Thanks. I think that gave very good insights. Now, when we look at the Indian healthcare macro analysis along with its peers, I think there is a sort of a very stark disparity which comes about. If you look at healthcare spends at 4.7% vis-a-vis some of our developing and emerging and developed countries. Even the aged population, stark difference in the numbers, birth rate, maternity, mortality, even more starker, and then things like the probability of people dying from NCD led things. So I think there are stark sort of disparities there. And then on top of it, we are seeing that there is what is additionally driving the market is things like medical tourism, rapid expansion of infrastructure outside of metros, significant R&D requirements, whether it's for pharmaceuticals or otherwise, and then there is increasing adoption of technology. So it seems that there is a huge demand which is piling up there, and it is probably supply which needs to really do some catching up. In this perspective, how do you look at supply, etc., shaping up over the next few years, given that there is a huge demand delusion which is around the corner or probably up there?
See, it's fundamental of economics. I mean, supply will follow demand, right?
Sure.
And there is no doubting of that. I mean, and right now we have the right political willingness in the country to really go after demand, right, from a supply standpoint. So I think we are in the right space. Now, speaking essentially on India, there are, in my view, there are 2 Ds which will drive this growth. 2 Ds. D number 1 is the demography. We are the only country which is producing 24 to 25 million new births every year, right? So, I mean, I oftentimes lightheartedly say that we create an Australia every year, right, in India. Yeah. So that's a very, very large population. You're talking about districts which has larger population than countries. The population of Greater Delhi is 3 times larger than the population of Belgium, right? So you're talking about very high demographic dividend here. Now, if you split the size of the population to the spectrum of ages, right? So we have a lot of babies. So you'll have pediatric care, neonatal care, all of that. And they progress into their youth, and currently we are seeing NCD or cardiac disease, for an example, hitting people as early because of lifestyle or food, genetic propensity. Today we see 25-year-olds on a cath lab table. So there is a very steady supply of youth, and then while we are largely a young country, our absolute numbers of aged people is tremendous. It's a huge number, right? So you say in Japan we talk about elderly care.
Yeah.
The number of aged people in India is far larger than Japan in absolute terms, while in percentage terms we are smaller. So essentially this is one of the very large demographic dividends that is going to drive healthcare in general and medical devices in specific. The other D that I would want to talk about is the diversity of disease, right? So we are talking about non-communicable diseases picking up. Really does not mean that malaria or filariasis or all of those infectious diseases have really been eradicated, right? So they are pretty much there, very much there. So we are in a position where we have a combination of both communicable diseases and non-communicable diseases. Both are scaling up, and whether it be medical devices or in vitro diagnostics, or radiology, I think the whole spectrum is going to be needing massive acceleration from the perspective of this demographic dividend and the diversity of diseases that we are, I don't know whether to use the word blessed, but unfortunately, yes, India is, frankly speaking, whether it is cardiovascular, cancer, diabetes, or infectious diseases, we still tend to be sort of the global big.
Sure. So just a quick follow-up on that. So it seems that, at least from the outside, that given such huge demographic dividends, the opportunities are there for the taking, right? Whether you set up a diabetes care center or you set up a chemotherapy center, etc. So, I mean, one key question that would come up is that within this whole thing, right, how would you sort of look at it and prioritize and see that, which are the areas in which one can sort of put their dollars behind and sort of satisfy or meet some of these requirements. So, for example, we know for a fact that India has not met their Millennium Goals, right? We know that there are a lot of chains concentrating on birthings, right? But they've just touched the tip of it, right? So, are some of these ones which which make sense from not only from a demand perspective, but also from a meeting their own sort of capital return perspective. So how would you sort of marry some of these things when you look at some of these micro sort of business models playing out?
Good question. Now, I'll start answering this with a caveat that I'm not a healthcare delivery expert, right? Yeah. So I have not spent any time in delivery. However, I'm intricately attached or associated to delivery because, medical devices would mean nothing if there was no delivery. Sure. We have all the technology, but they have all the patients, we have to work we have to work together. Now, to answer your question, I think in India, we will see an increasingly general swell, right? So whether it be, whether it is a nephrology center or eye care facility, or you see a chain of dental hospitals, or you see super specialty tertiary care hospitals, or you are going to look at HCL entering the primary healthcare space. There is opportunity across the spectrum. Now, what people would follow depends on their expertise and their strategic intent. But I personally think that it's a general scale up in every single plethora across the plethora of healthcare delivery. Now, what is driving this? Essentially, people, we are adding more people in the middle class. Affordability is growing. the government, thankfully, after several decades of trying to be the biggest provider of the country, is realizing that they don't need to be a provider. It's a very intelligent realization, right? And they are really becoming sort of the Uber or the Ola of healthcare, wherein they are becoming aggregators and they're sending patients to private healthcare at a very leveraged volume cost. And the third one is general awareness on health. People are, generally, today, because of Google or whatsoever, right? If you have a pain in your hand, you quickly Google and you figure out that you don't need to go to an orthopedician. Perhaps you should go to an interventionist. So these three, I think will contribute more and more to driving the sectoral growth. And the sectoral growth is going to be broad-based, and this broad-based sectoral growth is going to actually help medical devices.
Sure. Great. When we look at the medical devices market now in India, and we spoke about it being underpenetrated and growing at about 15%, I think there are substantial opportunities from the other side when we look at it. It is a sector which is growing at about 15%. It is highly import dependent. Mm-hmm. And most of the players lack scale. Mm-hmm. So about 65% of the companies are about less than about $2 million of revenue. And then again, interestingly, if I sort of draw a parallel again with, let's say, healthcare delivery and pharmaceuticals, there are hardly any companies out there which have sort of scaled up or have even sort of reached the capital markets. Yeah. Right. So and if you look at the device market by sub-segments, there are four key critical sub-segments: patient aids, consumables and implants, diagnostic imaging, instruments and appliances. Now, all these are growing double digit, but at different rates. So, for example, patient aids at roughly 20%, consumables at 14%, instruments and appliances at 15%, domestic imaging at 13%. And if you look at the demand drivers, which Probir has been talking about, for example, dual disease burden, growing infrastructure outside of metros, high birth rates, etc. This all ties in terms of the high growth rates. So we feel that there are opportunities across these sub-segments. Breakup of sub-segments. The instruments and appliances market is the largest segment, which accounts for about roughly 35%. This also includes things like ophthalmic instruments, dental products, and certain therapeutic appliances. Now, when we look at this and we try and correlate it with which are the sub-segments which you think will sort of lead growth in this overall market, and what sort of innovation do you see? For example, there's a company called Forus which has done innovation on ophthalmic devices. Yeah. So do you see some of these sub-segments? Do you foresee that there will be a lot of innovation, not only from multinationals but also from Indian companies, and therefore what sort of opportunities may come by for domestic companies?
I think we will see growth across segments. How they would be driven would be different. So for an example, I personally feel that in high-tech consumable and implants, we will perhaps continue to have large import dependency. But patient aids, again, if you're talking about low-tech aids, we will see a lot of localization, both by multinationals and by Indian companies. Diagnostic imaging is going to be driven largely by very large multinational companies building capacity in India. They've already started doing that, acquiring local companies and scaling up their local capacity. And if you look at things like orthopedic implants, you have seen some localization already happening, and I think it's only going to go north. So essentially, if you look at fundamental medical devices or low-tech medical devices, which are largely locally produced, you will see growth because of general healthcare penetration increasing, and with more and more specialization, training, education, device adoption, we will see specialty devices also finding a larger uptake, more hospitals, more uptake, more demand, and therefore more localized supplies is the mathematics that I would want to follow.
Great. So thanks, Probir. That's a great overview. Now, just to add to what Probir was saying, if you look at the domestic imaging subsegment, it is the second largest segment, which contributes to about 32% of the overall market. Now, there are three critical subsegments. You have radiation apparatus, imaging parts and accessories, and electro-diagnostic apparatus. And this segment is slated to grow at about 13% over the next 5 years, for 2014 to 2020. Now, the critical subsegments or key components are ECG machines, ultrasound, MRI, and CT scanners. This is a segment which is where there is high imports. It is dominated by multinationals in a big way, and you have very few Indian players in this segment. Now, the growth drivers are basically, rising dual disease burden, rising incidence of chronic diseases, and rapidly growing infrastructure outside of metros. So there is a great need to basically, conduct diagnostic needs for patients, and that is, and we'll continue to see a lot of innovation in this space. So, for example, multinational companies have come up with innovative products which allow convenience, portability, and we will see a drastic, change in this subsegment as more and more, healthcare delivery business models come up, and that will trickle down to, the medical device space as well. So the other critical sub-segment is consumables and implants. This accounts for about 18% of the overall market. Now, the big piece of this market is syringes and needles, which account for 70%. The other critical one is bandages, dressing, suturing material, and this sub-segment is going to grow at about 14% over the next 5 years. Now, if you see the concentration of this market in contrast to others, here it is dominated by the Indian companies. So, whether it is syringes or sutures, bandages, to a large extent is dominated by Indian players. Now, having said that, I think the growth over here is also, at 14%, is in double digits. And what is driving this is basically, the huge population growth in the market, high birth rates, maternal mortality rates, and rising incidence of CVD cases. And this is something which even Probir spoke about. Some of the leading players in this segment are basically Hindustan Syringes, Lotus Surgicals, and we have seen a lot of activity over here in terms of fundraisings. The other interesting one is patient aids. While accounting for about 16%, it is the fastest growing market at about 20%. Some of the key subsegments in this segment are, portable aids, orthopedic and prosthetic aids, and we are seeing opportunities across these subsegments. In terms of key trends here, there is a huge requirement for minimally invasive surgeries, which is growing the market. And some of the key players are Medtronic, St. Jude's, Smith & Nephew. Of course, this segment has also witnessed a few cross-border transactions. And now moving on, the other sub-segment which is not really covered in this, but very interesting, is in vitro diagnostics, and we'll talk about it. If we look at in vitro diagnostics, very interestingly, it is something which is not covered in most reports, because it has dual applications, and it is growing very fast, and even globally when we look at it, it is the largest segment and probably one of the largest growing segment as well. And we've also seen that there's been a lot of interest or acquisitions by global companies looking to get into this market. How would you look at this market? Do you feel that this will continue to be a fast-growing market? What kind of opportunities do you see in this specific sub-segment?
See, IVD is going to see rapid growth. It has already seen rapid growth. It will see much faster growth with regard to local capability. Why? Because most of the IVD products are class 1 products. They are low risk, from a medical, from a risk categorization standpoint. Most of them are, low risk products. So therefore, the regulatory tightness around them is lower, relatively lower, and therefore the entry barriers are lesser. So we will see massive growth. Now, some areas I personally think will deliver large opportunity. For example, we have a birth cohort of 24 million babies. Now, newborn screening could be the new next big thing. It's a huge opportunity. Not a lot is happening. Genetic mapping, etc. So genetic work around diagnostic genetic work will have large opportunity, and the financial markets are realizing this. I mean, you have seen two very large IPOs in the diagnostic chains, Thyrocare and Dr. Lal, both were tremendously successful IPOs. And this shows that the markets have a belief that Indian diagnostic is going to only solidify. Now, the large opportunity there from a deliverer standpoint is consolidation. It's still very, very fragmented. It's an extremely fragmented and therefore non-quality managed domain. In my belief, two things we will see. We will see more consolidation of practice, and we will see a lot more indigenous and multinational coming together on delivering local products and localizing supplies on IVD.
Great. Now, moving, I think very interestingly, what we are seeing is that the market from a funding perspective has relatively been muted. There've been in 2012 and 13 there have been a few interesting deals in the consumable space, and then of course in the diagnostic imaging side, but if you look at it, most of these transactions are probably less than $5 million. So going forward, do you still see that there will be given the huge growth that we are seeing, right? We spoke about, and you spoke very well about the demand, etc.
Yeah.
And the fact that companies do need to scale up given the high fragmentation. What do you think that the market will continue to see companies scale up and therefore raise funds over the next few years?
The short answer is yes. But I think the way the capital market approaches this will have to change a little bit. You are not in a market which is already built up. And therefore the capital interventions will have to be to build this up. Now, how do you build this up? You build this up through innovation, through development, through matchmaking. Today there are several small engineering companies in India who could benefit to work under the umbrella or the quality guidance or the R&D infrastructure or the R&D framework of a large multinational company, and there is benefit on both sides, right? But while I see private equity in the market, I don't see enough matchmaker service to connect this opportunity or this capability in India to the big opportunity of manufacturing low cost in India. So that's one piece. The other piece is that I have seen, and in my personal time, I do a lot of work with startups, medtech startups. And believe me, Gautam, it is very easy for me to raise $50 million for a plant and machinery that I already have and I want to, scale up. But it is extremely difficult for me to raise my first 50 lakhs of very, very seed, because you guys will take a business risk. You will never ever take a technology risk. And if nobody takes a technology risk in India, how will Indian technology come out or come about? So I think that, to my mind, is the biggest bottleneck here. People don't have access to seed funding, and to a large extent, under Startup India or what have you, if there was a larger focus. No, government is talking about medtech being a sunrise sector. Government is talking about startup being a very fundamental requirement, but there isn't a connection between these two yet. And if there was a connection, there would be a massive scale up. So without that, you would see that medtech tends to be reasonably profitable. I mean, we are not talking about very high levels of profit, but people are typically making anything between 5 and 15% operating income, right, on a small base. So your requirement of funds, which are disproportionate to your income, is not that high. So till such time you make somebody really either scale up or venture out into something very radical, this current logjam is going to, in my belief, continue.
Yeah. Also on the on the M&A side, right? We've of course seen a few transactions, mainly inbound, led by multinational companies in the areas of orthopedic implants, sutures, and IVDs. But I think the activity has been, low-key. And, given the fact that, yes, emerging markets hopefully will, play an important role in multinationals' overall scheme of things for growth, do you still feel that, multinationals would look at a build versus buy scenario when looking at India?
Great question. It depends on what technology you are talking about, right? There are several technologies in medtech that you cannot buy in India. You just can't buy. No matter how much soever you want to buy, you can't buy in India. Can you buy in Israel? You can buy in Israel. Can you buy in Silicon Valley? Yes, you can buy in Silicon Valley. Can you buy them in Japan? You can buy them in Japan. How many medtech incubators are working in India? Very few, right? So In my view, there is going to be more build than buy in the immediate term, and the buys are going to be largely in the area of the capacity, low-tech capacity that already exists. But there, the valuations will have to be right. Oftentimes, people don't buy because the local promoters have very, very inflated idea about their, valuation. So that's not worked. So that needs to change. But one thing is going to happen, and that we are seeing already happening, is that so far multinational R&D focus was largely geographically centered in developed markets. But whether it is Terumo, where I work, or Boston Scientific, which is setting up a 300 engineer R&D center in India as we speak, or it is a Philips or a GE who are developing, GE has developed their PET scan scratch up in India, PET scan nonetheless, right? And you're talking about Medtronic, which was not in renal globally, but they see India as a very large, because of diabetes, they because of the large diabetes prevalence, they see renal as a very large opportunity, and they have innovated completely to suit the market. And this is not even a product that came out of their global portfolio, right? So those are welcome and wonderful changes that we are seeing in multinational psyche, wherein the focus this far has been that I have a product, take it to India, and some of it to the market. And people are realizing, no, the opportunity is very large, and we really need to build something. Now, in my view, this local building of multinational is going to rub off on smart engineers. Indians are very smart people. A lot of these R&D innovators who operate in multinationals are going to branch out and start their own shop, and it's going to create a huge thriving medtech innovation environment.
Great. When we look at the current initiatives which the government has taken, whether it is Make in India and the push to create Make in India for medical devices specifically, whether it's the 100% FDI under the automatic route, or whether it is the draft changes, amendments in the DNC Act, so how would you sort of look at this? Do you think this is a much needed initiative? Do you think this will would this be a game changer, you feel, for the industry? And will this provide, the much needed impetus for it to move ahead?
Yeah, so when you are watching a trailer, it's very difficult to say how the movie is going to end, right? Right now we are watching a trailer, and the trailer seems good, right? For 30 years, I've been in this industry 26 years, and I have never seen a better time to speak to the government, and the government speaking to the industry. Now, today the government accepts that medical technology is different from pharmaceutical. There has to be different ways of addressing this. We are splitting the regulations, different from pharma, different from medtech. All of that is good news. So when you compare with your past, we are heading rock solid towards a good direction. But the moment you start comparing with other markets, then you see that you're not doing enough, right? So here the government, on a sunshine sector, on one side we are talking about sunshine sector, on the other side we are talking about price control. I mean, India has the lowest cost medical delivery, healthcare delivery in the world. Whether it's a knee replacement or a cardiac surgery, it is the lowest cost. And that would have not been possible if medtech was high cost in this country. It is not high cost. Yeah, our profitabilities are one of the lowest in this country. Volume growths are high, so people remain invested, and they remain interested. So yeah, net, the direction is right. but the speed at which we need to overcome this inertia of thinking that medtech, I mean, we are still regulated, so to say, our parent ministry has still been assigned to be Department of Pharmaceuticals, right? So you're essentially talking about, you're looking at medical technology, you're seeing it is very different from pharma, but you are asking the pharma people to drive the industry. That's one challenge. The other challenge is the fact that you're looking at very socialistic, backdated, control-orientated policies sometimes in a sector which should be completely market forces driven. So we need change, we need more change. We have started it, good news, but I think massively we need to scale this up. It will require a lot larger energy than what we are demonstrating now.
Now, moving on, I think there is a industry long-term vision of reaching, $50 billion by 2025. And the key pillars around that are, domestic demand, it is local innovation, and it is manufacturing hub. Out of this, I think there's an estimation that domestic demand will be about 20, manufacturing should be about 20, and local innovation is about 10. Now, I think when we look at what the government has done, and on the other hand, we have this vision which we are about 8 years away from there, 8 or 9 years away from that vision. I think the key question which comes to my mind is that, is this something which is purely aspirational? A, and B, what sort of business models will evolve out of these various facets, whether it is manufacturing, innovation, domestic demand, and what is required therefore to be able to get or at least get near to this $50 billion dollar vision. Yeah. So I think that's the key question which I'm sure everybody has in their back of their minds.
I'm not too sure if I'm a qualified person to answer everybody's question. I also have that question. Sure. But you asked me a question saying, is it an aspiration? Of course it is an aspiration. 15 years back or 20 years back when you went to United States, nobody played soccer, right? They aspired to play soccer very recently, some people. And today, they have created means, mechanisms, promotions, facilitations, etc., wherein today, non-Hispanic people, right, every evening they play soccer in America, right? So aspiration is the starting point. And thank God we have a $50 billion aspiration, right? If we have the $50 billion aspiration, even if we didn't fire the two engines of local manufacturing and local innovation, we'd still get to $20 billion, which is 4x the current size nevertheless. But yes, with the right architecture, there is a lot of dialogue between industry and government. There is a large realization that we need to really define Make in India for medtech. What is the purpose? Is it employment generation? Is it import substitution? Is it value creation? Is it technology augmentation? What is the purpose, right? And I think the dialogues are in the right direction. And nobody can say here. Sometimes I feel like I'm standing in a box office and selling a ticket at a reasonably high price, selling that ticket, but this show is going to start in 2020. Okay, but then that's how it is. It's a high development, long development cycle industry. Things don't happen overnight. It is not like a Gucci belt that you can, take a belt branded Gucci and it becomes Gucci, right? Sure. It's not like that. You can't make it so easy. Yeah. But in my view, the aspiration is good. It is very doable. It is very doable. Other countries have done it, right? But we have to realize that we have to have the right policy architecture to do the same. To give you an example, Puerto Rico, Ireland are the two largest, Costa Rica and Ireland perhaps are the two largest areas where multinational companies are today manufacturing medical devices. They both have zero import duty. Correct? And here in India, we are thinking if we increase import duty, people will manufacture medical devices. That's not going to happen. So, we have to really have a progressive policy architecture in the presence of a progressive policy architecture, both on a medical technology side and on creating access for medical services side. $50 billion, I believe, is very doable. Now, whether it is going to be happening at 2025 or 2030, who cares?
Sure. I think that's very well put. And if we try and break down the industry vision, there are three key pillars as we were talking about in the previous slides: domestic growth, local innovation, and manufacturing. So domestic growth is going to be about 20 billion. That's the vision by 2025, and that's purely the domestic piece of it. So the current 4 billion market will grow to about 20 billion, and on top of that, there is local innovation, which will hopefully account for another $10 billion. And then there is a vision to create or position India as a global manufacturing hub. And there's an estimation that that will reach about incrementally about 20 billion. So all in all, it is a position to be a $50 billion market with three key components to reach about 50 billion by 2025. If that happens, medical device will probably form about 18 to 20% of the overall healthcare market. So I think while Probir is saying that this is quite reasonable, I think with effective implementation of policies by the government, this probably is a realistic piece to achieve by 2025. Just to conclude and give our own Aurum views, is that yes, it's a very the industry stands at a very critical juncture. We believe that it's at an inflection point, given the initial jump start, etc., what the government is proposing in terms of regulations. I think because of this, there will be various business models which will come about, whether there will be companies focusing on manufacturing, R&D, or a combination thereof. So I think we think that India has the necessary ingredients, whether it is the engineering skills to be able to move forward in a meaningful manner and achieve its long-term potential of 50 billions or thereabout. So with that, I think we'll just we've come to an end to this presentation and webinar. We have a few questions which have come. So I'll just take a few moments to sort of go through those. The first question is globally, which are the critical sub-segments? And I think, the top 5 therapies account for about 50% of the $375 billion market. IVD leads the market with about $50 billion in size, followed by cardiology with about 42, orthopedics with 35, and diagnostic imaging with about $36 billion, and then followed lastly by ophthalmics. In terms of growth, I think neurology will grow faster than the market at 7%. IVD for sure at about 5%. Ophthalmics and then endoscopy are the other fast growing subsegments. The second question is, who are the leading MNCs generally, and then by sub-segment. The bigger ones are, of course, J&J, Medtronic, Abbott, General Electric, and all these companies put together account for about 50% of the entire market. J&J has strong portfolio across orthopedics, ophthalmics, diabetes. Medtronic's, while it is quite diverse, big segments are cardiology and orthopedics. Siemens is big in the diagnostic imaging, Roche in IVD, Abbott is in IVD, cardiology and ophthalmology, and GE, of course, very big in diagnostics and imaging. The third question is, what is driving the global consolidation? And I think in our view, the global regulations, are becoming very, stringent for, companies to be able to bring new products in the market. So regulators are becoming very stringent in terms of compliances. Pricing pressure is a very big factor where, governments are focusing on lowering their own costs, and therefore value is becoming more important. New technologies, the quest for new technologies, especially, minimally invasive technologies. And then there is a strong desire to build larger portfolios, to de-risk, etc. So I think that is causing the market to consolidate pretty quickly. Some of the larger ones which have taken place, of course, the merger of, or rather the acquisition of Medtronic with Covidien, Abbott and St. Jude's, and Zimmer and Biomet. The other question which is basically which subsegments in India have seen local innovation. I think we spoke a little about. I think Probir spoke about ophthalmology, that there have been devices, low-cost devices to detect and prevent blindness. There have been innovation in the IOL side, the intraocular lenses, where prices of lenses have come drastically dropped. Auro Labs has come about with a device which is low cost. We've seen on the imaging side, Perfent Healthcare, which has come about with a technology on the imaging side. TTK Healthcare on the valve side. So there's been, and then of course the consumable side, of course we have seen a lot of activity on that side as well, with sutures and a few other examples. The other question is on the recent initiatives on medtech infrastructure. I think there is some developments in Andhra Pradesh where they're talking about setting up a large medtech park, approximately 200 acres, which will provide all state-of-the-art infrastructure to potential companies which are housed there. The other question is basically on where has the private equity investments been concentrated. So the private equity investments have been focused on consumables. We've seen transactions happen in sutures, Lotus, and then of course there have been transactions on the IVD side. There have been transactions on the imaging side, ophthalmics and diagnostic. So those have been some of the key subsegments. And then again, the last question is basically, on the what are the trading multiples in this sector, and we looked at certain global companies, and the next 12 months on an EV to EBITDA basis is about between a range of 14 to 15 on a EV by EBITDA basis. This is next 12 months, 1 year forward. And on a PE basis, it's about 19 to 23 times. based, of course, on the size of the, on the company. So that's the global piece. Now in India, there are there are not too many companies which are listed out there. But you have Polymedicure, which is there, which is listed, and it's trading at on a 1 year forward basis at about 20x, and of course on a P basis 35 times. We believe, of course, whatever is happening in terms of the growth, these multiples are rich and therefore elevated. So I think we are with this we'll close the webinar, and I would like to thank all the participants, and of course Probir as well, for taking the time out and giving his precious insights. I hope this has been insightful for all the participants, and we hope you will join in for our next webinar hopefully soon. Thank you.